Was it Israel or Jesus that came out of Egypt? We'll talk about that today on Bible Time. Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining me once again for Bible Time. So the question today is, it would seem that when Matthew said in Matthew chapter 2, verse 15, that going to Egypt with his parents was to fulfill a prophecy that out of Egypt I have called my son, doesn't seem to really line up with what Hosea said in Hosea chapter 11, verse 1. So let's read both of them. First, I'll go to Hosea. When Israel was a child, I loved him, and out of Egypt I called my son. And now we'll go to Matthew chapter 2, beginning with verse 14. Then Joseph got up and took the child and his mother by night and went to Egypt, and remained there until the death of Herod. This was to fulfill what had been spoken by the Lord through the prophet. Out of Egypt I have called my son. So the problem is, it seems like Israel's called out in Hosea, but it's Jesus who is called out in Matthew. Yes. Well, what do you mean, Phil? What do you mean, yes? I mean, yes. Jesus is a representation of Israel. Israel is a representation of Jesus. You see, in the Bible, when we hear the story of Joseph, for example, when he was imprisoned, sold by his brothers, thrown into prison, seemingly dead, but resurrected into a new life. Sound familiar? We can go the same thing with Elijah. He was taken up into heaven via a chariot. He was ascended into heaven, just like Jesus. There are many stories in the Bible. I can go through Abraham. I can talk about Joseph. I can talk about Jacob, Moses, Elijah. All these people seem to mimic aspects of Jesus himself. But not only that, the entire concept of Israel, the entire nation, all 12 tribes of Israel, were in there, in a sense, a representation of Jesus. That's why he called 12 disciples to represent the 12 tribes of Israel. They were a representation of himself. And then he knew that when he went into heaven, he died on the cross and went into heaven, these 12 disciples, a representation of Israel, would go into the world spreading the message about Jesus or Israel. Okay, that seems kind of confusing, I know. But what we have to understand is that's the way God works. He takes human beings, a group of human beings, known as the nation of Israel, and he brings forth the Messiah through them, in particular through Judah, but he brings the Messiah forth through them, and then they kind of come back together and form the 12 tribes again with the 12 disciples, and go out into the world and spread to whom? To all of Israel, because Jesus, who'd he come for? In John chapter 10, I have come for the sheep of the house, the lost sheep of the house of Israel. So we can say then that Israel is a representation of Jesus, and Jesus is a representation of Israel. Therefore, when Hosea said, I have called my son out of Egypt, he called Israel out of Egypt in Exodus, beginning with chapter 13 and 14. They crossed the Red Sea, then they wandered in the desert in the book of Exodus. They came up out of Egypt to the promised land. So when he was saying that, yes, it had a representation in the physical of Israel coming out of Egypt, but it had a representation again of Jesus coming out of Egypt because he had gone there with his parents. And get this, when we all are caught up in the air with Jesus in heaven, at the very end, when he returns, we, as a body known as Israel, not the nation, but as spiritual Israel, will be pulled out of Egypt, the world, and caught up with the Son. So God has woven together parts of the Bible that you just can't deny it. You can't deny that it's real. I mean, let's think about this logically. Is someone back then a storyteller good enough to come up with such a story that we have today? Oh, sure, it probably could, but it didn't happen. This was God writing the Bible, weaving it all together so that it made sense physically and spiritually, because we are both physical beings and we are spiritual beings. So he wove into the Bible both the physical representation of Israel as a nation and the spiritual representation of Israel in the form of his son, Jesus Christ, who was redeemed for the promised land. And there you go. That's why when Matthew said in chapter 2, verse 15, that this was a fulfillment of the prophecy, it was a physical fulfillment of the prophecy, but it was a physical representation for Hosea, bringing Israel out of Egypt. But it was meant to be a prophecy of when Jesus would come out of Egypt. And also Hosea 11:1 as a representation of bringing all of us out of the world through Jesus Christ. It's pretty amazing the way the Bible works. A lot of times you'll see things, either dichotomy like that or a trichotomy, where 2 times or 3 times they come together to form a more perfect thing. I know this teaching might have been a little bit higher than what you're used to, a little bit more advanced than what you're used to, but every once in a while I want to throw those in there just to get you thinking. So thank you for watching me today. You've been a great audience as always. And again, we'll see you pretty soon for Bible Time at the Table. Goodbye and God bless.